Marley, sitting to Heather's right, is a fashion-based curator and writer based in Boston. Angela Latham, sitting to the right of Marley, is a teaching artist whose scholarship and practice emphasizes the history, materiality, and performativity of fashion and costume. And last but not least, Elizabeth Semohak is the creative director and senior curator of the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto, I believe, yes, whose work focuses on the intersections of fashion, economics, and gender with a particular interest in history and culture. So thank you, all of you, for traveling and being here to talk with us. Before we begin with the meat of our discussion, I thought it would be helpful for each of our panelists to just spend 5 minutes telling us about yourself and context and your work and what brings you to this conversation. So how about if I pass the mic down, because I think for recording purposes we have to use it. In this order?
All right. So the thing that brings me here today primarily is that in just a little bit less than 3 weeks, Cooper Hewitt will open an exhibition called Contemporary Muslim Fashion. This exhibition originated at the De Young Museum in San Francisco in 2018 and then traveled to the Applied Arts Museum in Frankfurt, Germany. The exhibition explores the rise in visibility recently of the Muslim modest women's fashion, as well as modest street style. And over 75% of the people whose work is represented in the exhibition are Muslim women under 40. So it's a very different group from the white European men that are typically celebrated in museum fashion exhibitions. So we're very excited to be presenting this exhibition. However, I felt that the conversation around modest fashion had shifted substantially since the exhibition first opened in 2018. And I wanted to bring some of those varied conversations into the museum context. So I spent the past 6 months or so interviewing young Muslim women designers about their engagement with modest fashion. In particular, the ways in which it intersects with sustainability and social justice issues. So with, I think, nearly 1 billion Muslim women worldwide, it is not surprising that there is a lot of variation in interpretation of what modesty means. So there's a prescriptive element to it, which is what people normally focus on, you know, which body parts have to be covered and so on. But to talk to women who are practicing modesty, they almost invariably describe it in terms of integrity and humility. But they also feel that other people within their community and outside their community often will associate wearing the hijab with other characteristics like being reserved or shy or demure. So in addition to the more obvious stereotypes associated with hijabi women, there are these more sort of subtle assumptions that they find themselves having to assert their right to be modest and loud, or funny, or political, or ambitious. So as we move into our conversation today, I think it would be interesting to include as part of our understanding of empowerment the freedom to express your full and authentic self, or all of your varied selves, depending on how you want to look at it.
I'm looking forward to hearing more about that for sure. Thank you so much to Julie and Sajida and Arti for having us here today. It's a real pleasure to be back in this room after about 25 years. I spent a lot of time in this room volunteering for various PBHA programs as an undergrad. And even though I also ditched a lot of classes to design costumes at the Repertory Theater up the street, I never thought that I'd be sitting here with you today speaking as a swimwear designer based out of China. So just tell you a little bit about my story. 2 days after I graduated from Kirkland House, I went to report to a Hagwon school in Seoul, South Korea, where I taught SAT and business English for the summer. And when I came back to America, I came back with this great love of every place that I had visited in Asia, and also a renewed desire to fulfill my life passion of designing women's clothing. And so I moved to New York City, and I graduated from Parsons in fashion design. And I worked at the Men's Costume Institute and Donna Karan, and then found a really tremendous group of female mentors at Liz Claiborne. And at Liz, I worked on a number of different commercial brands there, most of them targeting working women aged 30 and up. And the Liz dress division was just closing up shop, and our pantsuits were our best sellers. And, you know, in terms of thinking about empowering our customer, I think the furthest we got was sort of, if you look good, you're going to feel good. And that was kind of the line of the day. And it never occurred to me to imagine alternatives to designing the male power uniform, to translating that for women. And so that was just the beginning of the conversation of how women dress as their roles evolve and as our roles evolve in each chapter of our lives. And then I had a massive chance for a new education coming to me in 2006 when I had the opportunity to join the Liz Shanghai team on a one-year assignment. And I convinced my brand new husband to leave his job and accompany me there. And now we have lived in China for 15 years. And as you can imagine, the backstage of fashion looks very, very different from the front stage. And all the smoke and mirrors falls away. And I found myself standing in fabric mills surrounded by buckets of chemicals and dyes, and visiting factories full of women ages 18 to 24. And in 2006, when I arrived, that was a really transformational year, a pivotal year for China in fashion manufacturing. That was the year after quotas were abolished, and the WTO was expecting 80% of the world's apparel to now be made in China. And all of the social compliance issues of the 90s were sort of shifting out of China and onto countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia. And China was just beginning to wake up to the massive environmental impact of fashion. And the other thing that was happening was that cheaper cell phones were enabling the labor force to really call out negligent and non-paying factories. And so we saw a real amalgamation as well on the manufacturing scenes of factories that survived that. And so in addition to witnessing this environmental degradation that was going on, rivers were blue, they were red, they were whatever the color of the season was. And the rise of fast fashion in particular has forever changed our relationship with and our access to fashion, especially as women. And being able to experiment with highly designed, disposable clothing at Walmart price points has brought along an enormous amount of options for all of us. But at the same time, it's brought along exploitation of labor, resources, and vast amounts of waste. And so in thinking about empowerment, I feel like one of the big things that I can add to that conversation is thinking about how the quality of our labor and where things come from, how that relates to women in fashion especially, because we have a lot of power to decide where things are designed, manufactured, and ultimately produced. And generally speaking, if a t-shirt is $5, it's a woman who has probably been in an exploitative, unsafe situation making that shirt. So I'd like to unpack a little bit more of what goes on the backstage of fashion. In the time that I've been a designer, in the 20 years, we've thrown away over 250 million pieces of unwanted clothing, most of which has gone to landfill and has contributed to methane in the environment. And so that's the other thing, is that women are expected to be more affected by climate change than men, for instance, being the majority of the women's global poor. And so we definitely have a responsibility as well to think about fashion and climate change and women's empowerment all together.
Hi, thank you guys so much for inviting me to speak on this. So my name is Marley Healy. I am a museum professional and curator, and my special area of expertise is and focus is fashion and dress objects, primarily in museum collections. So what I mean when I say fashion and dress, to me, those and academically, those two words are not necessarily synonymous. Academically, when we refer to fashion, it's sort of in reference to a particular styling that is contemporary for the time period that is under discussion, whereas dress refers to the sort of complete assemblage of clothing, accessories, and other elements that are donned on the body. So I would almost categorize dress as something sort of corporal, and fashion as something that includes like an aesthetic element, although that is a very, very watered down definition of both of those things. I think that my colleagues would probably agree that we could spend these 2 hours talking and unpacking and debating what that actually is. But my approach to curating exhibitions tends to be sort of multidisciplinary, in that even if the show that I'm working on is fashion based or fashion thematic, the materials that I would be using to tell those stories are not going to be just dress objects. So that would be inclusive of other things from museum collections or pieces of art, things like that. So a relevant example will kind of give you the reason why I'm here today. For a little context, in 2017, I curated an exhibition at the Women's Museum of California in San Diego called Beauty or Torture, Society's Quest for Perfection Examined. The intention of the exhibition was not to necessarily reach a conclusion that the pursuit of beauty and all of its sort of highs and lows was good or bad, but rather to kind of explore these ever-shifting concepts of Western beauty standards and really investigate where they come from and show the kind of extreme lengths that people, mainly women, went to achieve these ideals. And there were ancillary narratives around men and sort of non-binary individuals' engagement with the subject, but that wasn't really the focus. We wanted to really focus on women's experiences because it was for the Women's Museum, and that is their bent. So we wanted to present the audience with objects, materials, and stories from our not so distant past that would evoke conversation around the psychology of engaging in what some people would consider extreme measures to achieve these ideals of beauty. And due, again, to the nature of the museum's collection and that they are the Women's Museum, a number of other factors, including location and resources, the focus had to remain rooted in Western fashion, which is, again, something you can kind of unpack and talk on and on about, but I'm not going to. We shared objects like corsets, so obvious things, waist trainers, cage crinolines, a perm machine from the 1930s. I don't know if any of you have ever seen what these look like. It really looks like a torture device. It's wild. But we showed those sort of in tandem with fashion and lifestyle magazines, fashion plates from the last 200 years, and photography and fine art examples alongside the outlets of social media. So within the exhibition, we explored questions like who was largely responsible for casting these ideals of beauty on society. Is it women? Is it men? Is it the fashion industry? Is it everybody? Is it nobody? Who is it? Does the responsibility lie within the fashion industry or the consumer to combat these sort of idealized or unattainable perceptions of beauty? And who should police that, if anyone? How have women used dress or lack thereof to communicate their political or social affiliations in contrast to assimilating into contemporary fashion? I mean, this is just a handful of things that we asked people throughout the exhibition to consider as they were sort of looking at these objects and materials. And then the objects served as these visual examples and representations of the subsequent pursuit, again, largely by women, of it through fashion and dress. So the bent, of course, was the comparison between instruments and articles of beauty and fashion to torture devices because of just how wild some of these items actually were. So in a nutshell, the context of why I'm here is my experience as a curator of these fashion and dress objects. A lot of the narratives and stories that I tell, they are very inherently women focused. So oftentimes I find myself sort of dealing with stories of empowerment and things like that. wonderful to be here with all of you, and I'm enjoying so much the stories already. Looking forward to yours. We have, as I mentioned to some earlier, we have such an eclectic group, and I think that's going to make for a very rich conversation in addition to your stories. In thinking about the question of what brings me to this conversation, well, I do have, of course, a scholarly record as a historian, particularly a blend of fashion and performance history. I might say more about that later, but I was thinking about this question in a very personal way and couldn't help getting an image out of my mind of myself as about an 8-year-old girl, because I think that's where the trajectory of my years in all of these discussions began. I was just getting to know my relatives, my extended family, for the first time. My parents had been missionaries in the Philippines as long back as I could remember, with a very conservative Christian sect. And we landed in southern Indiana in a small town of about 300 people near my extended family. So as I got to know those folks for the very first time, I was particularly impressed with my dad's sister, Lois. Aunt Lois was married to a pig farmer, my uncle, Paul, and she, of course, helped in that enterprise. However, if you watched her in her spare time around her house, there were paintings. She painted in her spare time. But more important to me, she sewed. She'd made most of the clothes for her whole family. And I took note of that as a young girl and basically demanded that she teach me how to sew. And so she did, and I'm always grateful to her. And I learned a love of fabric, and I learned a love of construction and garments and fashion. And I shared some of those other details of my personal story because there are aspects of that story that come into play in many later parts of my career and mindset towards women's empowerment with fashion, because as a member of an extremely conservative religious sect, I was very much censored in how I displayed myself as a young girl and as a woman. And so for me to learn how to make clothing was an incredibly empowering act. And even though it was within the constraints of a lot of body censorship and modesty codes, it also gave a little girl who lived in a town of 300 people where Frosty's barbershop was the cultural hub, and I'm not kidding, gave a little girl like me a place to apply her what turned out to be a fairly ambitious self, and learned creative functions and skills that served me later then as I became much more interested in not just garments and fashion, but in how people wear them and how they wear them to empower themselves, to express themselves. And they fascinated me then. By the time I landed in my doctoral program, I was searching for the dissertation topic. And you might not be surprised I landed in the 1920s at that point, because I found a great deal of resonance in my own experience of a period of time where, you know, it appeared that women were very much getting their freedom, but there was a lot of underlying censorship remaining. And I wanted to study that. And you can say more about that later. I've included a little bit of that research in the packets that have been shared. But since then, just to quickly sum up, the trajectory has been rather scattered. I have done performance art with cabaret pieces about performance and body issues, and I've also done work at writing, creative writing in the materiality of fashion. The piece Redressing that's included in the packet is my intimate exploration of a particular historic garment. So I do enjoy the tactile and materiality of fashion. And then rather late in the game, I've come to costuming. Even though I've been in theater and theater history for a long time, I've actually been doing more of that lately. And my historical interests continue. I have a few other projects ahead of me, but that's enough for now, I think. Okay.
Okay, let's see if this reaches. Okay. I also am thankful to have been invited to do this panel. I am the creative director and also the senior curator of the Battersea Museum in Toronto. And I started in 2000. I think I'm here for my work on the history of the high heel and speaker culture, my work on speaker culture. The museum itself was founded by a woman, I think Isabel Stewart Gardner, as being somewhat a kindred spirit to Mrs. Sonia Bada. She then built a specially made museum to house the collection, which now ranges around 14,000 artifacts. The oldest is 4,500 years old. The most recent are sneakers, some sneakers I got from Nike. And we collect artifacts from around the world and throughout time. And the joy of my job is that I can ask any cultural question I want. And I can go downstairs in storage and find a pair of shoes to start me down that road. I kind of always wonder why Mrs. Bada hired me. I get the question a lot that I do a doctorate in shoe history, and there is no doctorate program that teaches this. I am an art historian by training, and I studied Japanese art history. And when I was working in Japanese art history, I was focused on ukiyo-e, Japanese prints. And I pretty much came to the realization that I'm not interested in unique objects. I really don't care which unique genius made one unique piece for one person to buy. Of course, I love art history. That is the majority of art history, but I'm interested in things that are consumed en masse. And so while I was working on Japanese prints, which were mass-produced, switching to footwear allowed me to, okay, I switched objects, but I kept that interest in mass production. I think that shoes are meant to be consumed at the moment that they're created, and those that sell in the millions must speak to a cultural impulse. And so I am interested in standing back and looking at what those moments are, why they exist. But how I got started on high heels in particular was that when I arrived at the museum, Dorothy Koh, who's at Columbia University, was doing an exhibition on Chinese foot binding. Having done an Asian art history doctorate work, I was pretty comfortable with the subject matter, and I began to lecture quite a bit on the topic. And what I found was that because shoes for women who have bound feet are about 3 inches in size, people, the Westerners that I was speaking to, had a very visceral reaction. Oh my gosh, how can an adult woman's foot be 3 inches in size? Why did this happen? How did it happen? It went on for 1,000 years, on and on and on, a million questions. And half the people who asked me questions would teeter away in a pair of high heels. And I thought, nobody sees these. Like, you see a shoe for bound feet and you can't help but ask questions. You see a woman in a pair of high heels and maybe you say, you look hot, those are beautiful, but nobody asks the question, why? And why do only half of us wear them? And so I thought, why don't I try to figure out the origin of the high heel? Nobody had ever tried before. That's been also a great thing about shoes, is that it's highly understudied. And so it's like the Wild West of scholarship. And so I started to try to unravel what the history was. And this was 2000. That was the height of women are biologically predetermined to love high heels, and women are shoeaholics, and all of this nonsense. And so I began to trace what the real history was. And so my work has taken me as far back as 10th century Persia, where it is my thesis that it was invented, the high heel was invented to be used in tandem with the stirrup, which was invented just a little bit earlier. And that it was a form of military equestrian male footwear that was used and actually helped transform warfare. In fact, cowboys run around in high heels today, but we don't code it as high heels. We don't see it as feminine, even though structurally it lifts them up the same way. And so then I had to ask the question, okay, Europeans were constantly interested in everything from the East. I mean, you know, one of my goals in life is to make people not think that fashion is frivolous. Canada, which is where I come from, was settled, colonized, invaded because men wanted hats. Right? I mean, it's a serious economic engine. And it is a serious question that needs to be considered. And it does ultimately lead to questions about power. So in this work, I stepped back and I thought, well, Europeans actually knew, I was able to prove Europeans knew about high heels way before they adopted them. And European men were the first to wear them around the turn of the 17th century, and it actually had to do with Canada being invaded. It had to do with New World exploration and people now having access to Eastern goods in ways that didn't require the Ottoman Empire and Italy. And so the British, in particular, were really late to this game, and they decided that they wanted to get goods from the Far East by going overland, carrying their principal good, which was woolen textiles, another textile fashion-based product. So they schlepped all the way down to India, dragging their beautiful woolen cloth with the idea that they're going to come back with Indian cottons and Chinese silk. And what's the problem with it? Woolen cloth in India. Who needs it, right? And so they're schlepping it back, and they get to Persia, and Persia's like, delightfully cool. We'll take your woolen cloth. And the next thing you know, the European men, Shah Abbas, who's living at the time, he has high heels, and he is willing to join forces with Europeans. European men end up wearing high heels first, and then how women come to wear it, well, sorry, we can get into it. But anytime you look at fashion, it is never a whim. It is never because that's what I like. It is because of larger economic structures that must be considered, and power is central to those discussions.
So I want to speak up. Thank you all. This was fantastic to hear from all of you, and there's so much to talk about here. And I was going to begin with a question of my own and throw that out to you, but I suspect we have lots of eager audience members. So before I make my own selfish question, I'll save mine for a little bit later. I thought I'd offer Artie a chance.
This is really nice hearing all from you. My question is, why are women's bodies, and whether they cover it or not, a matter of subject of rules for countries to make? You know, there are certain countries where women are meant to cover certain parts of their body. Even in India, where I come from, there's women who live their entire life covered with their face covered. There are certain countries where not covering your body is kind of encouraged. So, any of that.
And can you repeat the question with the microphone, please?
Thank you for that question. So Artie asked, why are women's bodies and how they cover them or not the subject of rules in any country or any region of the world? Thank you.
Okay. I mean, so that is a big, big question. We could be here for 2 years discussing that. You know, I do think that it comes down to patriarchy and it has to do with power structures. And so if women's bodies are constantly controlled, then that is a form, either how much you show or how little you show, and whether or not you're deemed respectable, which is what both of those sort of play to, has to do ultimately with denial of human rights. Okay, I can just add. If you look at Enlightenment thinking, women's right to enfranchisement in the West was often discussed in terms of women are too irrational to vote. There's actually a New York Times article from the 1870s talking about how women don't deserve the right to vote because they are silly enough to wear French heels. And so once we code what women wear as ridiculous, silly, this is why fashion is frivolous is still something I feel we need to fight against, is that it's part of the construction of why women are undeserving of full enfranchisement and participation in the body politic.
All right, I certainly thought a lot about that too. The embodiment question, for me, is so central to investigating fashion and why some rules are formed and others, and certainly patriarchy was the word that jumped to my mind as well. It does seem to me that regardless of culture and historic period, there are you know, certain kinds of questions and issues that are raised. But when it comes specifically to the question of how much body to show or how much not to show, I do think it has roots in the, you know, the ownership, the women essentially being the property originally, or, you know, for centuries being owned by men and not having their own identity. You know, so that would be part of the history that we could interrogate and then see how that these manifestations in different cultures, some places where you're right. Either way, there's a paradoxical response, whether it's a culture or society that privileges women who are willing to show a lot of their bodies and display their bodies, or like conversely, a culture that or society that punishes women. Either way, that paradox is at the heart of the sort of no-win situation that I keep seeing in so much of fashion discourse. I'll just leave it for there and let others say things. If anyone has any other questions.
Other questions from our audience?
Mine was actually around the industry of fashion. So the industry of fashion is one that seems to be governed by men, and that's something that several of you alluded to in your opening remarks. So my question is around, you know, what should we as women be doing to take control of this? I mean, it's us that's wearing the clothes. It's us that's, you know, either the messaging or the perception of who we are comes from what we wear and how we wear it. So how should we be taking over? How should we be taking it to the forefront, both from the side of design or study or history or curation, which is what you all are involved in, but for those of us who are the consumers, who are the wearers of the clothing and the fashion, and what should we be doing and what does that mean for us?
Right. To that point, just to give you some perspective on that relative to corporate America in general, the fashion industry, about 14% only of the major fashion brands globally have women CEOs. So it's better than 4 or 5% C-suite and Fortune 500 companies, but not by much. And this is a question that I always had, because I had entirely female leadership and mentors up to a point, but always at the senior vice president and chairman level at the companies that I worked for were male. And I think it's the same as structure as pretty much anywhere in corporate America. But I think as consumers, again, that's something that we can all help to shift by, again, doing the money trail. Who does our purchase benefit? And I think rewarding companies that do have equal pay and equal representation of genders in their leadership, that have women leaders, female-led founders, that kind of thing. I think that doing your research and supporting companies that do employ those practices, it makes a big difference at the end of the day. I would argue that for corporate fashion, it is still, you know, at the bottom line, a financial game, and people tend to come at those levels from MBA programs and not from, you know, not just from design school. So again, making that leap from being a product person, I know this from myself, is going from being a designer and a product person to starting my own company 10 years ago. I had to really ramp up on everything that I didn't know, and that is a very different skill set than being a product person. So there's not always that leap between women designers and women in merchandising and marketing and all the other functions within a fashion company. But it's the MBAs and the people that have that corporate experience that tend to jump tracks into the higher levels of fashion. So again, as much as we can encourage and support companies who have female-led leadership teams, that is the ideal.
Yes, and to continue on that theme, we tend to focus on the visible or public-facing side of fashion, but that is truly the tip of the iceberg. Fully 1/6 of the world's population works in fashion-related industries. So we're talking about millions of women, most of them, you know, working for very little money in terrible conditions and being economically forced to do things that destroy the environments in which they live. So I think that anyone who has any kind of platform at all, whether you're a curator or a designer or a business owner or a model, is required to step up and work for systemic change in this industry.
It was alluded to earlier in the panel discussion about the idea of modesty evolving and taking on new meanings. So I'd like to hear more about that, particularly what comes to mind is sociologist Petty, who describes the Iranian Revolution, late 70s, women taking up hijab as a countercultural act and a revolutionary act. So what were the comments about modesty in our context today?
Yeah, so like so many things.
Question?
Oh, sorry. The context of modesty today in our conversation, like so many things, wearing a hijab can mean different things to different people at different times. Sometimes it's an act of rebellion, and sometimes it's an act of submission, and it has different meanings to different viewers. But from my perspective today, I'm here as a person. I'm here to listen and to understand the experiences of the people wearing hijab and other forms of modest dress. I mean, we're talking a lot about women today, but modesty is a concept that men are also expected to practice, and that's something that doesn't get a lot of recognition.
So I need to comment on that. So I live in the Middle East. I don't wear hijab, but when I travel to Saudi Arabia for business, which I do on a fairly frequent basis, I choose to wear the abaya. I no longer have to wear the abaya. The abaya is the long gown that you wear, and thank you, Dorothy. And then the scarf is something that women use to cover their head or to just stick around their shoulders. So I don't have to wear it. I choose to wear it because it's just easier. And it's warm, so I don't have to wear a winter coat. I mean, honestly, it's convenient. And I wear my sweatpants underneath. So I'm super comfortable and warm because it's quite cold there. So I think that it's what you said. It's about, what, I don't worry so much about what people are looking at me thinking. I worry so much more about the comfort level of it. Getting in and out of cars, being in the desert, all of that. It's just an easier, comfortable piece of clothing to wear. And it is a reflection of modesty, which is respected there for sure, but it's respected anywhere, I think, in the world. So when I talk to other women from Saudi or from the Middle East or from the Gulf about it, they choose to wear it. It's no longer something that they feel enforced to wear. I don't know if it ever was in countries like the UAE or Bahrain or Kuwait. It was in Saudi, but even now there, it's no longer something that people are required to wear. It's just something that people are choosing to wear for personal reasons, ease of comfort, ease of just, fashion even. There's beautiful abayas now that often cost much more than the most glamorous designer dress. So I think that the perception around it is changing, and maybe that is also a factor in the decisions and choices that women are making. And I see that in the context where I live, so I find it particularly fascinating. So I thought I would share that because it's different from perhaps what you're hearing in the media.
The question is trying to tie two things together. It's often said that women dress for other women and dressing for them. And given the role of women as consumer, purchaser, business owner, how can we leverage women's power to drive the sustainable development that people alluded to through fashion? How can we become an intelligent consumer if you set practice women?
I don't feel the crown of expertise on it in this question, but I will just say really informally for me, women influencing consumerism in the idea that women dress for women. I would say that just even as a historian being drawn to social media where people are displaying themselves in historical dress or promoting historical dress, one thing very simple, and this is
super practical, but not very academic. So the people who are the consumer experts, please chime in after me. But I'm very, very taken by some of what's happening, for example, in Instagram and the way that I'm influenced, and hopefully in what limited presence I have, I can influence in getting people interested in, for example, secondhand clothing and historical clothing, vintage clothing. And there's a really large community growing out there now, a market for not buying new clothing, not looking at the industry, the fashion industry as it is today, but to think about making your own clothes, construction. That's just one little piece I would contribute as an example from my own experience, and hopefully it seems to me that that's having great influence.
I have definitely agreed with that thought in prior years of my life, but I would say that it's a lot more complex than women dressing for women. I would say that we dress to code for our tribe, that we code for, look at, we're all in black. Like, we code for certain things that identify us with our people. And I think that we also use fashion as a way to receive or deflect attention to ourselves. And without any judgment on that, I don't think J-Lo was dressing for me at the Super Bowl. And it's like an interesting question. It's like, I do think, it's my working theory that the importance of women's fashion in a society, whether as a subject of being covered or not being covered, or just an emphasis on women's fashion, is correlated with the presence of gender inequality. I think that in societies that are more equal, you find less of parity, or more of a parity with fashion. In Shanghai, young men are just as interested in fashion as young women. And I specifically say Shanghai because that is a very different city than the rest of China and a different cultural mores. But I do think that people dress for their tribe rather than for men or women specifically. But I do think that the more emphasis that is placed on how women dress, you're going to find a larger amount of inequality between the genders.